Hey, welcome back to Grimerica. Whoops. Welcome back to Adult Brain Audiobooks. I'm Graham, one of the narrators here. We're doing an experimental live read of Ancient America in Notes on American Archaeology by John Baldwin. It was written in 1871. So we've been through the first 10 chapters. We are on chapter 11 today. You can go back to the live tab and see all the other ones. They're like half hour each. And this one is going to be challenging, but this is raw and unedited. I'm editing as I go, basically showing you how the sausage is made, that we are humans here in adult brain and not AI. So I'd have to check pronunciation sometimes, and it's sometimes a slow process, sometimes a fast process, but we are almost done this book. So welcome, and I will share my screen. We're talking about Peruvian ancient history today, chapter 11. We've been through the Mound Builders, Mexico and Central America, the antiquity of the ruins, whence came this civilization, American ancient history, the Aztecs, and Peru. And now I don't know what the difference between ancient Peru is and Peruvian ancient history, but here we are on the last chapter. So I'll share my screen here, my entire screen. Normally I would have like this on a full screen and this on a full screen, obviously, because it's easier, but now I'm just splitting it up for this exercise to just show the audio software as well here, which hopefully we can keep it going okay. So we'll jump into it. This is going to be, I'm warning you now, this is going to be the worst chapter yet on pronunciations and different words, some of them which don't exist anymore, some of them which have changed, but amatas. So I'm going to try my best here and be patient and stick with me, and we'll do it. We're almost done this book. So here we go. It's not working. It is not working. Let me just redo this and see if that makes a difference. Hmm. 50. Let's see. Check. There we go. Chapter 11, Peruvian ancient history. The Peruvians, like most other important peoples in all ages, had mythical wonder stories instead of authentic ancient history to explain the origin of their nation. These were told in traditions and legends preserved and transmitted from generation to generation by the Amutas. If they were also recorded in secret books of hieroglyphical writing, such as those found among the panos on the Ucali, which contained hidden things that no stranger ought to know, satisfactory evidence of the fact has never been brought to light. In addition to these, they had many historical traditions of much more importance, related in long poems and preserved in the same way. And there were annals and national documents recorded in the quipas. And there were grateful for the semicolons in these old books. And there were annals and national documents recorded in the quipas. Some of the Spanish writers on Peru who described what they saw in the country at the time of the conquest discussed its history. If they had used the proper sources of information with a more okay, let's see if I can keep this going. If they had used the proper sources of information with a more penetrating and complete investigation and studied the subject as it might have been studied at that time, their historical sketches would now have great value. Scroll up while I burp and take a breath. It's already challenging. Okay, here we go. The two most important works written at this time, the Relación of Sarmiento and the Relaciones of Polo de Ondegardo, were never printed. But none of these writers sought to study Peruvian antiquity beyond the period of the Incas, although some of them, Acosta, for instance, inquired sufficiently to see that Manco Capac had a mythical personage prefixed to the dynastic line of the Incas without actually belonging to it. This limited view of the ancient history, which was inconsistent with what could be seen in the antiquities and traditions of the country, was generally accepted because nothing more could be known in Europe, and its influence was established by the undue importance accorded to the Comentarios Reales of Garcilasso de la Vega, published in 1609. Garcilasso's history. Garcilasso de la Vega, excuse me, Garcilasso de la Vega, the son of a distinguished Spaniard of the same name, was born at Cuzco in 1540. His mother, named Nusta, was a niece of the great Inca Huayna Capac and granddaughter. Granddaughter. Oh, scroll up while I can. His mother, named Nusta, was a niece of the great Inca Huayna Capac and granddaughter of his no less eminent predecessor, Tupac Yupanqui. The intimate blood relationship which connected him with the Incas naturally drew attention to his work, and with more haste than reason was treated as the best possible qualification for writing Peruvian history. Therefore, his Comentarios acquired a very great celebrity and came to be regarded as the highest authority on all questions relating to Peru previous to the conquest. The work never deserved this reputation, although it was not without value as an addition to what had been written on the subject by Spaniards. Garcilaso was not well qualified to write a faithful history of Peru, either by his knowledge or by the temper of his mind. His aim was to glorify the Incas and their times, and much of his work was in the strain of tales heard in childhood from his mother. The Comentarios Reales The Comentarios Reales were written just as their author's training had prepared him to write them. He lived in Cusco without education until he was nearly 20 years old, his intellectual development being confined to the instruction necessary to make him a good Catholic. He then went to Spain and never returned to Peru. The next period of his life was devoted to seeking distinction in the Spanish military service, but political influence was against him and he could not attain the object of his ambition. He finally retired to Cordova, acquired some literary culture, and resolved to win distinction by writing a history of his native country. His materials for such a history, in addition to what could be learned from the earlier Spanish writers, consisted entirely of what he had learned of his mother and his early Peruvian associates at Cuzco, and of such acquisitions as could be gained by means of correspondence with his acquaintances in Peru, after the purpose to write a history was formed. Thank you, Rubial. Appreciate it. Yeah, that's a good book. That Lectures on Ancient Philosophy is really good. Morning, Cody. History was formed. I'm thinking of doing The Magus by Francis Barrett later, which is an underrated book of magic and esoteric wisdom, but I think it's kind of like almost the same as who's the guy from the well, when was he 12 1300s or whatever? We did the magic treatise on the four books. Why can't I think of his name? Anyways, it seems like it was based on his. Hey, Benjamin, based on his. But now I got to look for it. I'm going to look it up quickly while I'm talking about it. I'm talking about the magic of. It goes way back. Where's his books? I'm looking at my adult brain. Oh, Cornelius Agrippa. So I think it's very similar to Agrippa's books. I think he's even been accused of potentially just copying his books, but I might do that one live too. That's going to be a long slog though, but it'll be fun at the same time. Here, I'll go back to it. It can be seen readily that Garcilasso's history written in this way might have a certain value, while it could not be safely accepted as an authority. The first part of his work was published in 1609 when he was nearly 70 years old. According to his version of the Peruvian annals, the rule of the Incas began with the mythical Manco Capac and lasted over 500 years. And this version, with some variations and estimates of the time, has been repeated ever since. The dynastic line of the Incas thus determined is given to the work. Excuse me. The dynastic line of the Incas thus determined is given in the work of Rivero and von Tschudi as follows. 1. Manco Capac, mysterious son of the sun, who began to reign in 1021 AD and died in 1062, having reigned 40 years. 2. Sinchi who reigned 30 years from 1600. Whoops. 1062. Did I mess that up? Years. 2. I said 1602 instead of 1062. Am I getting dyslexic? 2. Sinchi who reigned 30 years from 1062 to 1091. 3. Loki. I just want to double check this. I studied this earlier to try and get some of these pronunciations right. It should be, let me just double check here quickly. Loka. There's almost too much here. There's the Sinchi. I checked Sinchi Cosco. There it is. Yoke. Yoke, Yupanqui. Yoke Kapanqui. 3. Loki. 3. Yoke Yupanqui reigned 35 years from 1091 to 1126. 4. Maita Capac, 30 years from 1126 to 1156. 5. Capac Yupanqui, 41 years from 1156 to 1197. 6. Inca Roca, 51 years from 1197 to 1249. Yawar Capac, 40 years from 1249 to 1289. Viracocha, 51 years from 1289 to 1340. His son Inca Urco reigned him. His son Inca Urco reigned after him 11 days and was then deposed as a fool incapable of governing. Tito Manco Capa Pachuc. Let me just redo that quickly here. T2 Tito Manco Capac Pachacutic. 9. Titu Manco Capac Pachacutic, 60 years from 1340 to 1400. Living, says tradition, to be 103 years old. 10. Yupanqui, 39 years from 1400 to 1439. And 11. Tupac Yupanqui, Garcilasso's great-grandfather, 36 years from 1439 to 1475. 12. Huayna Capac, the most glorious of the Incas, 50 years from 1475 to 1525. After his death, the empire was divided between his two sons, Huáscar and Atahualpa. This caused a civil war, which ended with the death of Huáscar in 1532. 1 year later, Atahualpa. 1 year later, Atahualpa was himself destroyed by Cortez. Manco Capac, here set down as the first Inca with a marvelous story of his mysterious origin and his miraculous powers as a civilizer, was undoubtedly borrowed from traditions of the origin of civilization in the more ancient times, which had been used by the Incas in support of their claim to direct descent from the sun. In reality, the first Inca was Roca, or Sinchi Roca, and several of the early Spanish writers were sufficiently well informed to see this. The period of the Incas must have been less than 500 years if their dynasty consisted of no more than 12 or 13 sovereigns. In other respects, this table of the sovereigns may be substantially correct, for there is a general agreement in regard to the names and the other. Got to redo that guy. In other In other respects, this table of the sovereigns may be substantially correct, for there is a general agreement in regard to the names and the order of succession, although Montesinos maintains that the fifth Inca on the list was borrowed by Garcilasso from traditions of a much more ancient sovereign who was greatly celebrated in the historical poems or confounded with him. The period of the Incas was very distinct in Peruvian history, but it is now understood that they represent only the last period in the history of a civilization which began much farther back in the past. Fernando Montesinos, the only Spanish writer who really studied the ancient history of Peru and the traditional and other records of the country was Fernando Montesinos, who went there about a century after the conquest. I'm not going to redo that burp. He was sent from Spain on service which took him to every part of Peru and gave him the best possible opportunities for investigation. He was a scholar and a worker with a strong inclination to such studies, and during 2 periods of residence in the country, he devoted 15 years to these inquiries with unremitting industry and great success. He soon learned to communicate freely with the Peruvians in their own language. Then he applied himself to collect the historical poems, narratives, and traditions. He succeeded in getting assistance from many of the older men who had learned of the Amutans. Amautas. He succeeded in getting assistance from many of the older men who had learned of the Amatas, and especially of those who were trained to read the Quipas. Nothing was omitted which could aid his purpose. In this way, Montesinos made a great collection of what may be called the old Peruvian documents, and gained a vast amount of information which no other writer had used or even sought to acquire. The materials collected were more important than his at once understood by those accustomed to depend wholly on writing and printing for the preservation of literature, because they cannot easily realize to what extent the faculty of memory may be sharpened and developed by a class of men devoted to this culture in communities where such mechanical aids do not exist. It is known. That's interesting. Check. It is known that long poems, stories, and historical narratives have been preserved by unlettered peoples, much below the civilized condition of the Peruvians. Long poems extending to 300 and 400 lines were retained by memory and transmitted from generation to generation among the Sandwich Islanders. Many scholars have believed that all the early literature of Greece, including the Iliad, the Odyssey, and all other poems of the cycle, were preserved in this way by the rhapsodists for centuries, down to the time of the Pisistratus, and then for the first time reduced to writing. This shows at least what they have believed was possible. In Max Muller's History of Ancient Sanskrit Literature, it is argued strongly that the Vedas were not written at first, but were transmitted orally, being learned by heart in the great religious schools of the Indo-Aryans as an indispensable part of education. This is likely to be true whether we assume that the Indo-Aryans had or had not the art of writing. For in the Vedic age, the divine songs of the Veda were so intimately associated with the mysteries of their religion that they may have been held too sacred to be made common by written characters. Therefore, it is no wise incredible nor even surprising that a considerable amount of literature existed in Peru without the aid of writing. On the contrary, it would be surprising if they had failed to do what has been done by every other people in like circumstances. The schools of the Amautas, is that still up? Oh, that's down. I don't know why that's down. The schools of the Amautas were national institutions, especially set apart for this. The schools of the Amautas were national institutions specially set apart for the business of preserving and increasing knowledge, teaching, and literary work of every kind. In a country where civilization was so much advanced in many respects, they could not have been entirely barren. Those who criticize Montesinos admit that his advantages were great, that no one equaled him in archaeology. No one, I think when it's in quotes, I can start from scratch. No one equaled him in archaeological knowledge of Peru, and that he became acquainted with original instruments which he occasionally transferred to his own pages, and which it would now be difficult to meet elsewhere. The results of his investigations are embodied in a work entitled Memorias Antiguas Historiales del Peru. This, with another work on the conquest entitled Annals, remained in manuscript at Madrid until the Memorias was translated into French by Monsieur Tourneau Campan and printed in his collection of original documents relating to the discovery and exploration of America. His scheme of Peruvian history. According to Montesinos, there were three distinct periods in the history of Peru. First, there was a period which began with the origin of civilization and lasted until the first or second century of the Christian era. Second, there was a period of disintegration, decline, and disorder introduced by successful invasions from the east and southwest. Southeast. Whoops, I made that mistake. Why did I think that said southwest? Check, check. Second, there was a period of disintegration, decline, and disorder introduced by successful invasions from the east and southeast, during which the country was broken up into small states, and many of the arts of civilization were lost. This period lasted more than 1,000 years. Third and last came the period of the Incas, who revived civilization and restored the empire. He discards the wonder stories told of Mano Kappa. There's the E's. There's the E's showing up as the C's. The typewriter they used must have dropped the C's because now we're back to E's as C's. He discards the wonder stories told of Manco Capac and Mama Wello. I better double check that. I missed that one. Let's see what it says. Oello, 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 Oello. My guess is Oello. Let's see what my assistant says. It's taking a long time. My assistant these days. It's just. I love how they always say, "Oh, maybe it's Ocello. Maybe it's a C. Maybe it's supposed to be a C." So this is that typewriter again. It is. It is a C. Oh boy. Ocello. So Ocello. What is that then? Ocllo. No wonder why my assistant took so long on that one. So it's Okyo, 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 Okyo. Oh, that makes sense. That makes sense. All right. Oh yeah, that sounds like a good book too. Magic, White and Black by Franz Hartmann. I will, if it's in public domain, I'll check it out. Yeah, I'll make a note of that. Magic, White and Black by Franz Hartmann. Yeah, I've heard of that guy, but I haven't read that book. That would be really interesting, though. I'd love to see what he has to say about the white and black because it is interesting what all these old theosophists and ancient wisdom people say about white and black, and now what they say about it these days. Okyo, Okyo. He discards the wonder stories told of Manco Capac and Mama Okyo and gives the Peruvian nation a beginning which is at least not incredible. It was originated, he says, by a people led by four brothers who settled in the valley of Cusco and developed civilization there in a very human way. The youngest of these brothers assumed supreme authority and became the first of a long line of sovereigns. I'm just going to double check something here. I see that one coming up. Ir Uko Uka U- Uku Topa. Let's see here. Pawa Pua Pahua Pahua Pua Pua Ir Ucho. Ir Ucho. Ir Ucho Topa. Montesinos gives a list of 64 sovereigns who reigned in the first period. The first was Pua Manco, or Aya Ucho Topa, the youngest of the four brothers whose power was increased by the willing submission of neighboring nations. His successor, called Manco Capac, is described as a remarkable character. Adjacent nations dreaded his power, and in his time the kingdom was much increased. Next came Juanevi Pishwa. Pishnua. Next came Juanevi Pishnua. Next came Juanevi Pishwa, and during his reign was known the use of letters, and the Amutas taught astrology and the art of writing on leaves of the plantain tree. Sinchi Cusco won victories and adorned and fortified the city of Cusco. Inti Capac Yupanqui, another remarkable character, divided the kingdom into districts and sub-districts, introduced a complete civil organization, instituted the solar year of 365 days, and established the system of couriers. Manco Capac II made great roads from Cusco to the provinces. These are the first 6 rulers named on the list. In the next 13 reigns, nothing special is noted save attention to civil affairs, occasional conquests, and a great plague. The 20th sovereign, called Huascar Titupac, gave all the provinces new governors of royal blood and introduced in the army a cuirass made of cotton and copper. The 21st Manco Capac, Amonta, being addicted to astronomy, convened a scientific council which agreed that the sun was at a greater distance from the earth than the moon, and that they followed different courses. In the next 12 reigns, wars, conquests, and some indications of religious controversy are noted. The 34th ruler, called Ayamanco, assembled the Amatas in Cusco to reform the calendar, and it was decided that the year should be divided into months of 30 days and weeks of 10 days, calling the 5 days at the end of the year a small week. They also collected the years into decades or groups of tens and determined that each group of 10 decades should form a sun. Among the next 29 sovereigns, Capac Ramuanta, the 38th of the line, and Yawar Hukis, I'm going to stick with that, the 51st, were celebrated for astronomical knowledge, and the latter intercalated. The 51st were celebrated for astronomical knowledge, and the latter intercalated a year at the end of 4 centuries. Manco Capac III, the 60th sovereign of this line, is supposed to have reigned at the beginning of the Christian era, and in his time, Peru had reached her greatest elevation and extension. The next 3 reigns covered 32 years, it is said. Then came Titu Yupanqui Pachacuti, the 64th and last sovereign of the Old Kingdom, who was killed in a battle with a horde of invaders who came from the east and southeast across the Andes. His death threw the kingdom into confusion. There was rebellion as well as invasion, by which it was broken up into small states. The account of what happened says, many ambitious ones, taking advantage of the new king's youth, denied him obedience, drew away from him the people, and usurped several provinces. Those who remained faithful to the era of Titu Yupanqui conducted him to Tambotoko. Those who It's hard to tell because the E's and C's are all fucked up. Those who remained faithful to the era of Titu Yupanqui conducted him to Tambotoko, whose inhabitants offered him obedience. From this it happened that this monarch took the title King of Tambotoko. During the next 26 reigns, the sway of these old royal house During the next 26 reigns, the sway of the old royal house was confined to this little state. These 26 successors of the old sovereigns were merely kings of Tambotoko. The country, overrun by rude invaders, torn by civil war, and harried by many simultaneous tyrants, became semi-barbarous. All was found in great confusion. Life and personal safety were endangered, and civil disturbances caused an entire loss of the use of letters. The art of writing seems to have been mixed up with the issues of a religious controversy in the time of the Old Kingdom. It was prescribed now, even in the little state of Tambotoko, for we read that the 14th of its 26 rulers prohibited under the severest penalties the use of quella for writing. Is that an E? I better double check that. Quella, Q-U-E. It must be L-L-C-A. There's now all of a sudden the italic C is on the key on the typewriter seems to be working. Quelka? Quill. I mean, it's almost like quill, right? Like a pencil or pen. May appear in Quilka, Kilka. Yeah. Interesting. Kilka, Kilkia. Okay, Kilkia. Got to remember that. Kilkia. The use of quella. So I'm just going to go back a little bit farther. Prohibited. Kilkia. Prohibited under the severest penalties the use of kilkia for writing, and forbade also the invention of letters. Kilkia was a kind of parchment made of plantain leaves. It is added that Amauta. It is added that an Amauta who sought to restore the art of writing was put to death. This period of decline, disorder, and disintegration, which covered the dark ages of Peru, lasted until the rise of the Incas brought better times and reunited the country. Roca, called Inca Roca, was the first of the Incas. He was connected with the old royal family but did not stand in the direct line of succession. The story of his rise to power is told as follows. A princess of royal blood named Mama Chiboka contrived by artifice and intrigue to raise to the throne her son called Roca, a youth of 20 years and so handsome and valiant that his admirers called him Inca, which means Lord. This title of Inca began with him and was adopted by all his successors. He appears to have had great qualities as a ruler. Not much time has passed before his secured possession of not much Okay, here we go. Not much time passed before he secured possession of Cusco, made war successfully against the neighboring princes, and greatly extended his dominions. Under his successors, the empire thus continued to grow. Under his successors, the empire thus begun continued to grow until it was extended from Quito to Chile and became the Peruvian Empire, which the Spaniards robbed and destroyed. Probabilities. It has been the fashion to depreciate Montesinos, but I find it impossible to discover the reasons by which this depreciation can be justified. It is alleged that he uses fanciful hypotheses to explain Peru. The reply to this seems to me conclusive. In the first place, he is, in this respect, like all other writers of his time. That was an age of fanciful theories. Montesinos is certainly no worse than others in this respect, while he has the merit of being somewhat more original. He brought the Peruvian civilization from Armenia and argued that Peru was Solomon's Ophir. Undue importance has been accorded to several of the old Spanish chroniclers, whose works contain suggestions and fancies much more irrational. In the second place, his theories have nothing whatever to do with his facts, by which they are sometimes contradicted. He found in Peru materials for the scheme of its ancient history, which he sets forth. Readers will form their own estimates of its value, but no reasonable critic will confound this part of his work with his fanciful explanations, which are sometimes inconsistent with it. For instance, his theory assumes that the first monarch of the Old Kingdom began his reign as far back in the past as the year 2500 BC, but he reports only 64 rulers of that Old Kingdom. Now, if there were so many as 64, and if we allow an average of 20 years to each reign, which is sufficient, we cannot carry back the beginning of that first reign to the year 1200 BC. There is another objection, which must be stated in the words of one of the critics who have urged it. Montesinos treats the ancient history of Peru in a mode so original and distinct from all others that we can perceive it to be a production like a novel and unknown. If this means anything, it means that it was highly improper for Montesinos to find in Peru what was unknown to poorly informed and superficial Spanish writers who had already been accepted as authorities. It would have been singular if his careful investigation, continued through 15 years, had not given him a great amount of information which others had never taken pains to acquire. His treatment of the subject was original and distinct from all others because he knew what other writers did not know. His information did not allow him to repeat the marvelous story of Manco Capac and Mama Cello. What was that one again? Ochik. No, I've already forgotten it. Ochu. Where is it? Where is it in here? Ocho. Okyo. Okyo. His information. Okyo. Okay. His information did not allow him to repeat the marvelous story of Manco Capac and Mama Occhio, nor to confine Peruvian history to the time of the Incas. But when the result of his inquiries was announced in Europe, Garcilasso and others regulated the fashion of Peruvian studies, and the influence of their limited and superficial knowledge of the subject has been felt ever since. The curious theories of Montesinos may be brushed aside as rubbish, or be studied with other vagaries of that age in order to understand its difference from ours. But whoever undertakes to criticize his facts needs to be his equal in knowledge of Peru. His works, however, tell us that can ever be known. What? His works, however, tell us all that can ever be known of Peru. Okay. His works, however, tell us all that can ever be known of Peruvian ancient history, for the faculties for investigation which existed in his time are no longer possible. It may, however, be useful to consider that the main fact in his report on the subject is no more original and distinct than the testimony of the monuments around Lake Titicaca. The significance of this testimony is now generally admitted. There was a period in the history of Peruvian civilization much earlier than that of the Incas, a period still represented by these old monuments, which, so far as relates to this point, are as novel and as original as Montesinos himself. That the civilization found in the country was much older than the Incas can be seen in what we know of their history. Their empire had grown to be what Pizarro found it by subjugating and absorbing a considerable number of small states, which had existed as civilized states before their time. The conquest of Quito, which was not inferior to the Valley of Cusco in civilization, had just been completed when the Spaniards arrived. The Chimus, subjugated a few years earlier, are described as even more advanced in civilization than any other Peruvian community. The small states thus absorbed by Peru were much alike in manners, customs, manufactures, methods of building, and general culture. It is manifest that their civilization had a common origin, and that to find its origin we must go back into the past far beyond Inca Rocco, the first of his line, who began the work of uniting them under one government. Moreover, there were civilized communities in that part of the continent which the Incas had not subjugated, such as the Muiscas on the tableland of Bogota, north of Quito, who had a remarkable civil and religious organization, a temple of the sun built with stone columns, a regular system of computing time, a peculiar calendar, and who used small circular gold plates as coin. They were described by Humboldt. The condition of the people composing the Peruvian Empire at the time of the conquest bore witness to an ancient history something like that reported by Montesinos. There were indications that the country had undergone important revolutionary changes before this empire was established. The Peruvians at that time were not all one people. The political union was complete, but there were differences of speech and, to some extent, of physical characteristics. Three numerous and important branches of the population were known as Amares, Chincas, Chincas. Hmm. Three Amares, Chincas, and Huancas. Three numerous and important branches of the population were known as Aymares, King. Three numerous and important branches of the population were known as Aymares, Chincas, and Huancas. They used different tongues, although the Quichua, Quichua, they used Quichua, whoops. They used different tongues, although the Quichua dialect spoken by the Incas, and doubtless a dialect of the Aymares, to whom the Incas belonged, was the official language in every part of the empire. There was a separated and fragmentary condition of the communities with respect to their unlike characteristics, which implied something different from a quiet and uniform political history. These differences and peculiarities suggest that there was a period when Peru, after an important career of civilization and empire, was subjected to great political changes brought about by invasion and revolution, by which the nation was for a long time broken up into separate states. Here, as in Mexico and Central America, there was in the traditions frequent mention of strangers or foreigners who came by sea to the Pacific coast and held intercourse with the people. But this was in the time of the Old Kingdom, as the Malays and other Malays, Malays, as the Malays and other island people under their influence formerly traversed the Pacific. This is not improbable. Some have assumed that the Peruvians had no communication with the Mexicans and Central Americans, and that the two peoples were unknown to each other. This, however, seems to be contradicted by the fact that an accurate knowledge of Peru was found among the people inhabiting the isthmus and the region north of it. The Spaniards heard of Peru on the Atlantic coast of South America, but on the Isthmus, Balboa gained clear information in regard to that country from natives who had evidently seen it. To what extent there was intercourse between the two civilized portions of the continent is unknown. They had vessels quite as good as most of these constructed at Panama by the Spanish hunters for Peru, such as the balsas of the Peruvians and the shallop of the Mayas seen by Columbus, which made communication possible up and down the coast. But whether regular intercourse between them was ever established, and everything else relating to this matter, must necessarily be left to a calculation of probabilities. Conclusion. If, as seems most likely, there was in South America an ancient development of civilized human life, out of which arose the civilizations found in Peru and Central America, its antiquity was much greater than can be comprehended by the current chronologies. This, however, cannot make it improbable, for these chronologies are really no more reasonable than the monkish fancies used in the 16th and 17th centuries to explain these civilizations. We find the hagiologists very absurd, but the condition of mind which made them possible is closely akin to that which moves some men in our time to deny or limit the past and reject the results of any investigation which tend to enlarge it. Rational inquiry constantly forces upon us the suggestion that there was more in the unwritten history of the human race than our inherited modes of thinking have allowed us to suppose, and that the beginning of civilization is far more ancient than our long accepted theories of an antiquity are able to admit. What may be discovered in South America by a more complete geological and paleontological investigation, it is not now possible to say. Professor Orton, in his recent book, The Andes and the Amazon, far exceeds Montesinos in the estimate of the antiquity of Peruvian civilization. He says on this point, geology and archaeology are combining to prove that Sorrato and Chimborazo have looked down upon civilization far more ancient than that of the Incas, and perhaps coeval with the flint flakes of Cornwall and the shell mounds of Denmark. On the shores of Lake Titicaca are extensive ruins which antedate the advent of Manco Capac, and may be as venerable as the lake dwellings of Geneva. Wilson has traced 6 terraces in going up from the sea through the province of Esmeraldas toward Quito, and underneath the living forest, which is older than the Spanish invasion, many gold, copper, and stone vestiges of a lost population were found. In all cases, these relics are situated below the high tide. Hmm. Qua, Guyana, Guayaquil. In all cases, these relics are situated below the high tide mark in a bed of marine sediment, from which he infers that this part of the country formerly stood higher above the sea. If this be true, vast must be the antiquity of these remains, for the upheaval and subsidence of the coast is exceedingly slow. Page 109. Page 109. This refers to the discoveries made on the coast of Ecuador in 1860 by James S. Wilson, Esquire. At various points along this coast, he found ancient or fossil pottery, vessels, images, and other manufactured articles, all finely wrought. Some of these articles were made of gold. The most remarkable fact connected with them is that they were taken from a stratum of ancient surface earth, which was covered with a marine deposit 6 feet thick. The geological formation where these remains were found is reported to be as old as the drift strata of Europe and identical with that of Guayaquil, in which bones of the mastodon are met with. The ancient surface earth or vegetable mold with its poverty. This is the drift that Ignatius Donnelly talks about in the book we just published. It came out on Audible called Ragnarok, the Age of Fire and Gravel. The ancient surface earth or vegetable mound with its pottery, gold work, and other relics of civilized human life was therefore below the sea when that marine deposit was spread over it. This land, after being occupied by men, have subsided and settled below the ocean, remained there long enough to accumulate the marine deposit, and again been elevated to its former position above the sea level. Since this elevation, forests have been established over it which are older than the Spanish conquest, and now it is once more subsiding. In 1862, at a meeting of the Royal Geological Society, Sir Roderick Murchison spoke of these discoveries as follows. The discoveries of Mr. Wilson has made... The discoveries Mr. Wilson has made of the existence of the works of man in a stratum of mold beneath the sea level and covered by several feet of clay, the phenomenon being persistent for 60 miles, are of the highest interest to physical geographers and geologists. The fact seems to demonstrate that within the human period, the lands of the west coast of equatorial America were depressed and submerged, and that after the accumulation of marine clays above the terrestrial relics, the whole coast was elevated to its present position. Assuming the facts to be as Mr. Wilson reports, and they have not been called in question, it follows that there was human civilization to a certain extent in South America at the time of the older Stone Age of Western Europe. The oldest Peruvian date of Montesinos is quite modern compared with this. The fact may be considered in connection with another mentioned in the section on American ethnology, namely, that the most ancient fauna on this continent, man probably included, is that of South America. But without regard to what may be signified by these discoveries of Mr. Wilson, there is a good reason for believing that the Peruvian civilization was much more ancient than it has been the fashion to admit. Peru would now be a very different country if the Spaniards had been sufficiently controlled by Christianity and civilization to treat the Peruvians justly and seek nothing more than friendly intercourse with them. But they went there as greedy buccaneers, unscrupulous robbers, and brought everything to ruin. At no time since the Spanish conquest has the country been as orderly, as prosperous, or as populous as they found it. It has fallen to a much lower condition. Industry and thrift have been supplanted by laziness and beggarly poverty. Ignorance and incapacity have taken the place of that intelligence and enterprise which enabled the old Peruvians to maintain their remarkable system of agriculture, complete their great works, and made them so industrious and skillful in their manufactures. The region covered by the Peruvian Empire has not half as many people now as it had in the time of the Incas. Is it possible to imagine the present inhabitants of Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia cultivating their soil with intelligent industry, building aqueducts 500 miles long, and constructing magnificently paved roads through the rocks and across the ravines of the Andes from Quito to Chile. One of the scholars connected with a scientific expedition which visited South America. My cat just jumped in the way. Zeusy. One of the scholars connected. He had to help himself to some of my coffee. Unbelievable. One of the scholars connected with them. Where was I? Right at the end, right at the end of the book, basically. One of the scholars connected with the scientific expedition which visited South America in 1867, describing the ancient greatness and present inferior condition of Quito, exclaims, "May the future bring it days equal to those when it was called the city of the Incas." He might appropriately utter a similar wish for the whole country. All right, so that is the last chapter. Tomorrow I'm going to do the appendix, which is the Northmen in America. Uh, wow, the Welsh in America. What's the other one? Antiquities of the Pacific Islands and deciphering the inscription. So yeah, go through the whole appendix tomorrow. Probably it'll be a fairly long session, but that's the book. There you have it. It'll be out on audio at some point, all edited and mastered and all that. But this is just raw. So thanks for being here. I'll see you tomorrow for the finale. Support our other work. It's got all our stuff on Audible and Spotify as well. Other narrators, not just me. And check out this channel. Help share the channel and check out the catalog. There's like 600 videos in here of audiobooks. Thanks for being here, and thanks, Ruby. I will write down that thing right now. The Magic Black and White by Franz Hartmann. I wonder if I've got that in my notes somewhere already. Yeah, and thank you very much. We'll see you soon. Have a good weekend.